Good afternoon, everybody. Very welcome to this Patrick seminar. I'm Sharon Biermann, the director of Patrick, and I've just got a few words on the order of business before we really start proper. Firstly, we will be recording this. It is an iMove project, and they've asked that we record it so that they can distribute it more widely. So we are going to record it. Charisse will probably turn on the recording now. Please accept. Secondly, we're planning to run from now until around 4:30. The last half an hour is for questions. So if you can just put your questions into the chat as they come up during the presentations, and then I will run a process then to direct the questions to the relevant presenter at the time. Then just to look at the program for the next 2 hours. Claire Thompson, who's the steering committee chair for this project, will provide the welcome and just talk about the relevance of this work to their activities in the department. Kerry Curtis will then take over and introduce the project, as well as looking at one of the first components, which is the employer perspectives. Kerry is an adjunct professor with Patrick at UWA, and that's just one of many roles that she plays at the moment, experienced in the area of travel behaviour, transport and land use planning, accessibility planning, institutional barriers to urban development. Following Kerry will be Doina Olaru, talking about the employee perspectives with a particular focus on travel. Doina is Associate Professor at UWA's Business School, experienced in transport modelling and particularly interested in the links between urban environment, transport, travel behaviour and its impacts. Carolyn Knight will follow on Doina, looking particularly at the work aspects from employer perspectives. Carolyn is from the Centre for Transformative Work Design at Curtin University. She's particularly interested in work design interventions, job crafting, well-being and performance. Then we have zoom into travel demand trends and travel demand scenarios. Tristan Reid will present the observed trends, followed by Brett Smith looking at the scenario development that we did. So Tristan is a Patrick Research Associate from Curtin University, working very closely with Brett and Doina at UWA. His research investigates transport systems through the use of spatial and statistical analytics and modelling alongside visualisation. Brett is Senior Lecturer at UWA Business School with expertise in travel behaviour, demand management, choice modelling and transport economics. Kirsten will then zoom into productivity impacts. Kirsten is Associate Professor at the School of Social Sciences at UWA, and she looks at balancing fundamental research with applied outputs to inform economic development, strategic policy and decision-making across all levels of business. Kerry will then pick up the highlights from everybody's presentations, pull them all together and look at the recommendations for the way forward in terms of policy, not only for the transport portfolio, but wider in an integrated way. That'll bring us to around 4 o'clock, and then we've got about a half an hour for questions, which you will have raised in the chat function as we go along. Right, so without any further ado, let me pass you across to Claire Thompson. Claire has been the steering committee chair, doing a lot more than just steering, chairing the steering committees, but linking us in all across government with key people and giving us excellent feedback on all our in progress work. Claire's Manager of Mobility Futures and Innovation at DOT. Thank you, Claire, for all your inputs to this project, and over to you for the welcome.
Thank you, Sharon. Kaya, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this Patrick seminar entitled Working from Home, Changes in transport demand, the case of Greater Perth. First of all, I'd like to thank you for responding positively to our request to move this to an online event in favour of opening this up to as many people as possible. Perhaps in itself, this has confirmed that the convenience of online meetings has changed the way we move and just how much we can squeeze into our busy working days. Before I start, I'd like to remind you that each of today's presenters and those with me in this room are coming to you from the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to respectfully acknowledge their elders and their continuing connection to this land. The work we're planning to discuss today came about in June 2020, not long after the COVID-19 pandemic began, via an expression of interest from iMove, which is an Australian industry and government collaboration for applied research in transport and mobility. From this process, 12 submissions were received from academic institutions and 4 were shortlisted for funding. The Patrick submission we received was seen to be particularly relevant to travel demand in Perth, with clear connections to public transport optimisation objectives, which remain important to us within the context of Metronet development. The project was considered to draw on local data from a range of sources and perspectives, which has complemented other national studies, often drawing on quite different East Coast-centric experiences. The Patrick project was jointly funded by the Department of Transport, Main Roads WA and the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. The project kicked off in November 2021, and with today's seminar, the project work is now complete. It is our expectation that this work will assist us to reflect changing movement patterns in our strategic transport models in the future. Additionally, it will help us to provide Perth-relevant policy guidance on working from home practices, noting the utility that working from home provides as a travel demand management tool, which is useful beyond just mitigating congestion on our transport networks. So now I'll hand over to Professor Kerry Curtis, who will give us an overview of the project and lead us into some of the sections of work she coordinated on employer perspectives. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Sharon. Welcome, everyone. So hopefully you're seeing a slide now that's saying research purpose and questions. And as Claire said, we started quite some time ago now, more than 2 years ago. The purpose of the research was to get an understanding of the spatial incidence of work from home, the extent of travel reduction work from home can deliver, and any associated productivity benefits, and that was based on actual experience, and you're going to hear from the empirical research in this project. Understanding that was envisaged that we'd be able to move towards developing a suite of policy initiatives that could support the positive aspects of working from home, so that we could capitalise on the wider benefits to society. But that's obviously while recognising the potential negative effects and developing policy initiatives to address those. So we had this set of core questions. We were asked to look at the extent to which work from home had been or has been undertaken and will continue, to look at the productivity impacts, and that's from several perspectives, from individuals, from employers, and from the and for the economy at large, to look at the proportion of reduced travel demand that we could attribute to work from home, to consider the utility of work from home as a future travel demand management tool, such that it could mitigate congestion on all transport networks, to think about the higher levels of work from home, to enable expansions of the road network to be either deferred or avoided, and as I said, to think about the full suite of policy initiatives that would be required to continue work from home practice. So our research approach, several streams of research going concurrently, some followed. So my role was to look at the perspectives of employers or businesses, Doina and Caroline and others to look at employee perspectives. We also looked at transport demand. You're going to hear a little bit about each of those. That fed in to the transport scenario evaluation and the productivity evaluation. In each of these phases, we drew on a wider literature, and I guess the understanding of those strands of research has led to our development of potential policy responses. So I'm going to give you very quickly the key headlines, just so you've got something to pin the quite detailed and sometimes complex results that the team are going to present to you. So in terms of, and these headlines are in relation to those research questions that I put up. So prior to the pandemic, work from home rates were minor. But what we've seen during the pandemic is a significant acceleration of work from home practices. The employer interviews suggest that that was just part of a trend towards more flexible working practice as they developed. The employee surveys found 16% of work hours per week were work from home, compared to an estimated 5% and 8% in the pre-pandemic period. The employee surveys also found a preference for 29% of weekly work hours to be work from home. One of the interesting things that we've uncovered is that work from home is determined much more by the type of work task rather than fitting neatly into any industry sector or occupation class. And I think that's something for us all to think about as we go on and develop the transport models. And when we talk about work from home, we're talking about a hybrid model as the preferred option for both employees and employers. So in terms of the land use implications, as a result of that hybrid work from home approach, there's certainly been, in terms of internal floor space, some cases where that internal floor space is contracted because fewer staff are in the workplace at any one time. But it's not black and white. In other cases, there's been an increased demand for floor space because of a move towards what's called activity-based work approaches and the need to improve physical distancing of staff. In terms of external changes, there's certainly an interest in movement away from central office locations by some, with a relocation to the suburbs closer to employees' homes. And there's also an interest in the use of shared workspaces or suburban work hubs. And then we were asked to think about or to understand the travel demand impacts. And as Sharon introduced, we've looked at induced demand. So during the pandemic, there was an increase in road traffic in inner suburbs, but that was not the case for middle and outer suburbs. Some of this increase could be attributed to significant population growth and also to the suspension of car parking fees in the Perth Central Business District. At the same time, public transport patronage declined, down by 16% at its lowest point compared to February 2019. And then it's still sticking with observed demand since the beginning of this year. What we are observing is that road traffic volumes are returning to pre-pandemic levels and that public transport patronage is showing signs of recovery, with bus passengers climbing more sharply than train. In terms of the demand scenarios, there are 8, and I was asked to write the overview report and found it quite cognitively challenging trying to remember 8 scenarios that were called 1 to 8. So this graphic is to try and give you a quick look at what we were trying to test. So if you read the graphic going from left to right, you're looking in green at the increased rate of working from home. So the middle one, the 10% rate of working from home, was based on the empirical evidence from the employee surveys. If you read the graphic from top to bottom, what you're seeing then with the scenarios is changes in either the mix of transport modes or the trip types. So in yellow, the pre-COVID mode share was applied. In the orange colour, it accommodates the mode share with this shift of 15% from public transport to car, and then some what-if scenarios for a worsening situation that even with work from home, daily commute trips were being replaced by trips of other journey purposes, and then rebound trips. So with the extra time of not commuting, people were undertaking more trips. And as I say, they're what-if scenarios. And it's not my intent that you can read that necessarily the text inside that, just to get this graphic of the 8 scenarios in your head for later. Productivity impacts. So employers noted that unlike their past concerns, staff productivity has been maintained, and that's increased the confidence in work from home. In the employee surveys, they found savings from commuting were converted both to paid and to domestic work and indoor recreation with productivity and well-being benefits. Removing 1 in 10 work commute trips as a significant annual transport economic impact of a saving of 204 million for those who remain on the transport network, and 395 million for those who commute less by actually working from home. And total transport system benefits range between 198 million and 783 million, based on the average individual benefit of 5,500 per annum. The road infrastructure investment implications, that was one of our research questions. What we've found is that the scenario modelling suggests then very significant annual savings in terms of those transport economic benefits, and certainly suggests that road infrastructure investment can be deferred. Also, that relaxing the car park charges in the Perth CBD did result in increased traffic volumes, and certainly demonstrates the importance of travel demand management by car, especially in the central area where public transport accessibility is high, is the best in Greater Perth. I'll move on then with my 1 slide on employer perspectives to give you a little bit more detail, and then hand over to Doina. So I conducted a series of in-depth interviews with 20 Perth-based businesses. I believe a couple are here today. And I'm sort of using colour coding. So green was a positive, good news story. The yellow, less so. So as I've already alerted in the headlines, there's significant acceleration in work from home practice, some attributing that to this trend towards more flexible work arrangements as part of trying to retain, if you like, the best workforce for that employer. Work from home then determined, rather than you being able to simply say it's a particular type of industry or a particular occupation, is determined more by the type of work task. And that being the case, all occupations have the potential to work from home for some time of the week. And I had a discussion only last week about frontline workers in health, who they also have administrative tasks. They could be done at home if they so wished. Not all employers are in support of continued work from home. And certainly in the interviews, it was clear that work from home is less suited to those in new jobs or at an early career stage, where they need the mentorship that's achieved by working alongside colleagues, those ad hoc conversations, the ability to pop in and ask simple questions. But unlike past concerns, staff productivity has been maintained or even improved. And this has built confidence in continued work from home practices. And interestingly, client-facing roles are also possible to achieve via digital means rather than exclusively by face-to-face meetings. And in fact, I think probably as we're experiencing today, some clients actually prefer digital contact than face-to-face. So a popular model for work from home then is the hybrid model, which is usually up to 2 days a week worked at home. In the headlines, I mentioned this change in internal floor space requirements, so something for the town planners amongst us to think about. And interestingly, this movement away from central office locations. Employers noted that staff were keen on work from home to reduce commuting, and those consequent benefits for the employees of extra time and energy for work. The undertaking of household tasks, if you call it a task, several of them raised that staff like to be able to take their children to school on those particular days, spend more time with children, go to school assembly and so on, and to do more exercise. One of the questions in the interviews was asked about whether there was any transport policy of that particular employer or business, whether they took any responsibility for the way their employees commuted into work, with the interest in terms of the idea of reducing the need for travel. Nobody had, if you like, a sustainable transport plan. Some claimed that they were located in the central area, for example, because it had good public transport accessibility. And that's me. I'll hand you over to Doina and quit sharing.
Thank you, Kerry. Hi, and hello, everyone. While I'm sharing my screen, I'd like to mention that the contents of the presentation will be a general description of the models that we've undertaken. Okay, it seems that I'm sharing, but it's not visible. Perhaps I'll try again and move the screens. Okay. Bear with me for a second, please. So that I'll see on the bigger screen, but probably not. Okay. Trying again. This is embarrassing, isn't it? When technology is
Well, now, otherwise, Charisse can share as the screen and just operate it for you.
Yeah, probably if I, one more time, I'm, it's asking for updating drivers and everything else. So it's.
There we go. No, yes.
Yes.
There you go.
Is it showing or not?
It's showing.
Okay, finally. So this is teamwork as we already designed from 2020, and the type of survey that we. Okay.
Doina, just hang on, just hang on, please. We're seeing a very small picture.
If you can just turn off with the notes rather than the actual big screen.
Okay.
So I think it's the wrong screen that's being
there we
shared.
go.
That's better. Yep.
Okay. Too many screens. So the point that I'm trying to make with the conceptual model is that while the presentation is on some very high level aggregated statistics, the design of our instruments had in mind to search for those sources of variability that can explain changes in commuting, working from home, which are the implications for the travel demand and the traffic in general about the future, and also how the time is split during daily activities. What are the conditions of work and implications for well-being? So my part is primarily the orangey yellow part, But at the bottom, where you can see the work design and organizational support is Caroline. In terms of the vehicle kilometers traveled and traffic implications, Tristan and Brett will talk about it, and general productivity and satisfaction, you'll hear more from Kirsten. So let's first understand who are these respondents from Perth. So we started with more than 2,800 people. The numbers here are showing primarily those who completed the modules of travel and work. You notice that there were questions for values, there were questions, attitudinal questions about modes of transport. So the focus is only on those. We have collected more than 700 original raw data variables, qualitative and quantitative. So there were a combination of open questions with the traditional closed-ended questions. Now, because we used a panel, it is expected, even if disappointing, that there is attrition. So we ended up with 1,500 to the wave 2. So wave 1 was in May, starting in May 2021. Then to allow for changes in September, we had wave 2. And then we had February this year, wave 3. So we ended up with 750 overall people completing the wave 3, and we've been list-wise deleted, so we were considering only complete data without necessarily imputing anything. A few things that I'd like to draw your attention to. So we have 2/4 of these respondents being females. So obviously we do not have that gender balance in our sample, who responded at least 10 hours of work in the previous work. But this is primarily because we oversampled some of the occupations, either the front line or the occupations where we had professionals and clerical and admin, because we wanted to have representativeness at the industry level and occupation level. Then in terms of the age, it is much more balanced. We had more than 1/4 between 25-34. This shifted towards 45-54 later on. 2/4 were full-time workers. We didn't have any respondent in our survey who had difficulties or unemployment during the survey time. And they were equally split between companies that are small, with less than 50 employees, and over 500, so large companies. So again, it is not a representative sample in terms of the sizes of the companies. We know that in Australia we have less than 1%, but is representative of the labor pool. 40% of them were essentials and frontline, and less than half in hybrid industries, and the other elements were consistent with the census data. So in order to counter any particular effects of these differences between the population and the sample characteristics, we applied weighting by gender, age, and industries. Now, in terms of classifying our respondents, we used the interval of 10% to 90% of the time being from home UR. In the hybrid location, mostly at home means more than 90% of the time, mostly workplace being the converse. So we noticed that across the 3 waves, there are some changes in the sense that the hybrid group reduced in terms of the proportion. and we had an increase in those who were primarily working in the workplace. The average number of hours also increased across the three surveys, and the largest number of hours was recorded for the hybrid group with almost 35 hours. It is interesting to see that in terms of the preference for the number of hours to work, consistently it was lower with an average of about 31, 32 hours in the future. For commuting, we compared commuting pre-COVID and the last week when people worked at least 10 hours. And the average commuting frequency was about 4.37 across the three waves, and consistently lower in the last week. So we noticed a reduction of about 0.5, 0.6 trips per week for commuting in the waves compared to the pre-COVID. Interestingly, although the distance for commuting is similar across the waves, slightly lower in wave 3, but not statistically significant, we noticed that the duration of the commute increased. And there are a number of explanations for this. It is also due to the sample attrition and some changes in the mode chosen for commuting. But even for those who had exactly the same origin destination for commuting, and they had the same mode of transport, primarily car, they reported an increased duration of the commute, and this is correlated with the qualitative comments that actually the morning commute has become longer due to congestion. In terms of the commuting patterns, we noticed that the highest presence at the workplace is on Wednesday, and the highest commuting rates being during the week with working from home primarily on Friday, Monday, and more recently on Thursday. So that anecdotal evidence of including the end of the working week or the beginning to create a longer weekend seem to be supported by the data. We noticed that the number of commuting days changed. The diagram is showing proportion of the commuting days from no commuting at all. So those at the bottom represent people who are working only from home, and those at the top, people who are working even during the weekend. So what is obvious is the proportion of those working 5 days a week is decreasing. The proportion of people working fewer days, primarily 3, increased from wave 1 to wave 3. And if we are considering that pre-COVID, the proportion of people who worked 5 days or more was more than 60%, this is a substantial change. The mode share hasn't changed substantially across the waves. We obviously notice a reduction in the public transport and some changes in other modes, primarily combinations. The dominant, almost 80%, is the car driving. What I'd like to highlight is the number of stops that was significantly lower than pre-COVID for the commute, and the fact that the satisfaction is very high. One was considered extremely satisfied on a scale up to 7. If it is about the time of day for the commuting, there is no substantial evidence in favor of rebound travel or changes in the patterns in the morning for other purposes. Obviously, they are pertinent. We notice fewer commuting departures in the morning peak, especially in the third wave, more before 6 a.m. or after 7 p.m., but more data, and especially capturing all the trip purposes, is required to answer that question. So here it is a comparison pre-COVID and last week. And the only difference that is noticeable is a more active travel, which was recorded everywhere in the world, and increase in the car driving and passenger, with a reduction in the public transport for multiple reasons. Unlike our eastern states or other areas, the main reason for changing from public transport to other modes reported by the respondents was longer commuting trip, or inconvenient, or more expensive, with very little concern about social distancing and requirements for wearing a mask.
Longest 2 minutes.
Longest commuting trips were by public transport. These are some of the reasons for stopping. Obviously, consistent with the evidence everywhere, online deliveries increased. Spatial mapping is showing that most commuting trips are reflecting our origin destinations with the CBD and the main activity centers. So here we have the top origin destination pairs. And in terms of the models, I'll only highlight one or two. The proportions of hours working from home is significantly dictated by the influence where people work, so their perceived flexibility. Obviously, it is lower for those in the frontline occupations and hybrid, and it is positively associated with commuting satisfaction and some social demographics. If we are looking at the commuting rate and duration, the main impacts are obviously working from home. So if you have the flexibility, in this case, this is reducing the amount of commuting and the commuting duration. Females have fewer trips. In general, if you have a larger number of chores to include into your chain for commuting, you are more likely to take that commuting trip, and obviously the distance is an important predictor for duration. So in terms of what dictates the mode of transport, there are opposite signs for the car driving and the public transport. The number one, the most significant predictor for the mode was availability of free parking available at the workplace. Car ownership has an important role, the number of stops, and the distance and duration. Social expectations were also increasing the proportion of public transport use, and the same for active travel. Looking in the future, 60% of the respondents indicated it is likely to have sustained and significant changes to what we've seen before COVID and even during the pandemic, but these changes are uncertain even at this stage. While many of our respondents indicated working from home is feasible and they would prefer to work more from home, there is still a group that would prefer to work in the workplace, with only 10% having full preference for working from home. Questions in terms of barriers and facilities for working from home indicate that the nature of the work is the main obstacle, but also decisions and culture of the organization's policies are a deterrent. Equal number is for personal decisions, primarily people considering that the home environment may not be conducive to work, or infrastructure that is inadequate. In terms of facilities, it was pleasing to see that the library and IT services are considered to be essential for work in the irrespective of the domain, with home office equipment stores and cafes following next, and then some food and childcare and facilities for physical and mental well-being. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to Caroline now.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. So I'll just share my screen, and you can tell me whether you can, which
yes.
version can you see the big slides? Yep, perfect. Excellent. Then I will just go through briefly what I'm going to talk about. So talk about the aim of the work survey, then I'm going to cover some of the general work characteristics, sort of descriptive statistics that we found, talk about a bit about well-being and performance over the 3 waves, and then significant differences between the work location groups. That's those who worked from home, those who worked from the office, and those who were hybrid. And then we're going to look at some predictive models like Doina did, and then I want to talk about hybrid work design profiles, which focuses specifically on the hybrid group rather than the other 2 groups. Okay, so we'll get started. So the aim of this section, or this part of this survey, the work survey, was to explore employee work experiences over time when working in different locations. That is from home, workplace, and hybrid, and the impact on well-being and performance, because that hasn't really been systematically looked at. As Doina said, she looked at the top part of the model. I'm going to focus on the bottom part of the model, which is really around how work design impacts well-being and performance. There's a lot of research show that it does, but there's less research to really understand how hybrid work impacts that, and how things like organizational support and flexibility can influence that as well. And also, I feel it's important to look at the actual psychosocial work characteristics rather than simply dichotomous, like did people work from home or not, as people have these work experiences at home. It's not just a sort of black box. It's kind of, we do actually experience something when we're working from home, and that's really what impacts our well-being and performance. So I won't talk about the sort of like the who took part, as Doina has already done that very well. So to focus on the actual mean work design scores across the time points, here you can see the 3 time points and the work characteristics that we looked at. So we looked at where people, the influence people had over where they worked, where they actually had a suitable place to work, but then these social characteristics such as whether they had autonomy to schedule their own work, and whether they got support from managers and colleagues, whether their workload was high, whether they experienced homework conflicts, and whether they experienced close monitoring by a manager, which is particularly pertinent now that people are working more from home. We've seen a rise in this kind of close monitoring behavior. We actually found that the characteristics were very stable across time. The only small differences we found was that in scheduling autonomy, there was a significant increase between T1 and T2, so that's time 1 and time 2, and support, colleague support apparently significantly decreased between time 2 and time 3, but generally pretty stable. Same was the case for work well-being and performance across time. So we looked at things like job satisfaction, how whether people experienced vigor, that kind of energy at work, whether people experienced burnout, also loneliness, and then these performance variables, which were around proficiency, how adaptivity, so whether people can adapt their tasks and things when working from home, and proactivities, where the amount that people work proactively did things, I guess, to improve their situation, and also their own self-rated productivity. And these were all pretty stable across the 3 time points. In terms of general well-being, we found that anxiety and depression actually significally improved.
Okay. I've just finished this and I could be.
Oh, sorry, there's some people that we can hear. Can you please mute?
I wasn't sure if someone was asking me a question.
Sorry, Caroline.
That's all right. No worries. Yep. So in general, well-being, we found that anxiety and depression significantly improved across time, and this may be because obviously the threat of the virus decreased, and also people understood it more, so they may have had less fear and unknown uncertainty around it. The next thing I did was to look at significant differences across time between the work location groups. So looking at people who stayed in the office, people who stayed hybrid, and who moved locations. So looking across time, we actually found that around 10% stayed hybrid across 3 time points. So there's quite a lot of movement between whether people move between being hybrid to being fully in the workplace to being, fully at home. Or around 60% stayed completely in the workplace, and 30% are saying move between those work location groups. And the only significant differences we found were in the influence over work location, with obviously those people who stayed hybrid, as expected, we had more influence over the work location. And in terms of proactivity, again, those people who stayed hybrid tends to be more proactive. In predictive models, I'm just going to show you 1 or 2, like Doina did. So here we looked at whether work characteristics could actually explain more variance over and above other factors, which might explain outcomes as well, and looking at vigor, which is that kind of energy at work and kind of that enthusiasm for work and sort of a positive work well-being state. We did find that work characteristics and particularly influence over where people worked and lower homework conflicts and lower monitoring drove vigor. In terms of burnout, we found, as expected, kind of higher workload and higher work-home conflict drove burnout, and this was over and above other factors such as occupation, demographics. And in terms of loneliness, as you might expect, lower colleague support particularly drove loneliness over and above other characteristics, and homework conflict drove a lack of productivity. So productivity obviously was improved when there was less homework conflict, which is something we would expect. But I think I want to take you to something which is more interesting from my point of view, at least, and that's to look at hybrid work design profiles. And what we did here was we actually looked at, we used a person-centered approach and looked at natural subgroups of people where people clustered together with similar kinds of characteristics. So we actually asked people about their characteristics when they were at home and their experience of those characteristics when they were in the office. So we asked people 2 sets of questions about the home and the office in terms of their autonomy and support, workload and close monitoring. And here what we did was we clustered those to see whether people had similar or different experiences. And we found that there were kind of 4 profiles of people. And here you can see we have listed kind of the characteristics of people when they're working from home, obviously, and when they're working from the workplace. So the work from home autonomy, for instance, is the one that's now circled, work from home, and workplace is next to it. So you can compare kind of the autonomy within the work from home and in the workplace together. Hopefully that makes sense. We found generally 4 profiles, and the first profile was this average profile where people tend to had average characteristics according to the sample population, low monitoring, but were a bit more divergent between the characteristics at home and in the workplace. Like there you can see the autonomy was lower when they're working from home than when they're in the workplace. And the same for the other characteristics, tend to be lower at home than in the office. And so we called this divergent. We then had a profile, next profile was a passive, high monitoring, convergent profile, where people, is because people tended to have low work characteristics when they were either at home or in the office, and they had high monitoring. Next profile is profile 3, where people tend to be more active, which we refer to having more autonomy and support, which is what we call an active profile. But there's low monitoring, and this was more convergent, so that the work characteristics are kind of similar across the work and home context. In profile 4, this was a more demanding profile because workload was actually the highest for all 4 profiles, and there was high monitoring in this profile, and they were quite divergent in terms of there were significant differences that we found within the profile in terms of their home and work characteristics. So how does this actually relate to outcomes? Well, we had outcomes at time 2 and the profiles were at time 1. So it relates to outcomes at time 2 because those profiles which had lower monitoring and higher resources, so that would be higher autonomy and support, had better wellbeing outcomes and predicted more life satisfaction and thriving. These were the active low monitoring convergent profiles and the average low monitoring divergent profiles. And then when monitoring was particularly high, we really saw that drove anxiety and depression. So these are the profiles where profile 2 and 4, where you've got high monitoring. And in terms of drivers, what actually drove people to be in these profiles, we had a look at several things at demographics, and we found that in general, people in profile 3, so that's the active low monitoring convergent profile, tended to be older, higher up the hierarchy, had more influence over their work location, and had more organizational support for flexibility. And they tended to be really in the probably most optimal profile with the highest autonomy and support, average kind of a good level of workload, so being entertained as you like, but not over challenged perhaps, and then low monitoring, so they had kind of better outcomes.
2 minutes, Caroline.
That's fine. I'm on my takeaways. That's perfect. So my takeaways from this is that the overall quality of work is more important to consider than whether individuals work from home or not. So that's really thinking about those work experiences. Work characteristics explain variance and outcomes over and above a number of controls, such as age, gender, occupation, work location. Often in the research, work characteristics can be ignored as a reason for why people's well-being might be high or low. So I think it's really important to highlight that, you know, work characteristics is actually something that can be redesigned. Managers and leaders design jobs, so they have the power to actually redesign jobs as well and work with employees to make them more, make them so that, you know, people can actually be members of perhaps more optimal profiles, if you like. And then for hybrid workers, the presence of autonomy and support really drove well-being. So I think that's shows how important those things are. And that close monitoring drove anxiety and depression. And that's something that managers do have control over, how much they monitor people and also the way they monitor people. So, you know, whether you're checking in or checking up on people, for instance, can be really important. And that's something that can actually be redesigned as well. And then, as I just said, also leaders and managers design work, therefore they can actually create higher quality work and try and create those profiles for people where they have autonomy and support, but not being over monitored, so that they can actually perform at their best. And then, you know, that can help with people with hybrid work. That's everything I have. So thank you very much for listening. And happy to take questions as well at the end.
Thanks, Caroline. So now we've got, so please pop your questions into the chat and we'll pick up with them in the last half an hour. Now it's over to Tristan and Brett for a look at travel demand trends and scenarios.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Caroline. Are we seeing the slides come through there? All well and good? Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for coming along today. Brett and I have done some work here in terms of looking at trends and using them amongst some of the work by pretty much the entire teams of academics here to inform some what-if scenario planning for the future in terms of the effects of work from home on the transport network. I'll be talking for a few minutes here about some of the observed trends that we've seen over the road network, public transport network, and even from some census data as well. Then I'll hand over to Brett, who will speak for a few minutes and talk about how we came together with the scenarios and the evaluation of those scenarios. I think I can probably speak for us both when we say a big thanks to the strategic modelling team at the DOT, who helped us quite intimately with this work, as well as the rest of the project team as well. So in terms of where we started here, of course, we've seen anecdotally quite a big change in travel patterns throughout COVID, certainly depending on where you are in the world. Us here in Perth were a bit luckier, I would say, than most in that we didn't really have huge lockdowns for the most part, compared to, I think it was 212 days in Melbourne and quite a few days in Sydney as well. Nonetheless, for various reasons, there's obviously been quite a large increase in working from home, as we know. So we kind of wanted to understand the differences in travel patterns from what we'll call before COVID. So that is the year 2019, the last year we had before the pandemic kicked off, compared to during and perhaps post-COVID. Certainly some people have different opinions as to whether COVID is still going or whether COVID's finished. I think the pandemic's still going on. We had news today of mask mandates coming back in Queensland, so I don't think we're out of the woods yet. Primarily to achieve that, we looked at secondary data systems, observing from sensors throughout Perth, primarily loop counters and augmented data there in terms of the road network on arterials throughout Perth. In terms of the public transport system, we looked at two sources, smart card data and also the publicly available overall system data that's provided by the Public Transport Authority, which also includes free boardings and things like that that aren't counted on the Smart Rider system. From there, we compared patterns, trends and outliers during this time. Some of that data alongside, for example, the employee survey conducted by Doina and others, as well as the employer survey, helped us build the scenarios, but I won't talk too much about that as Brett will have plenty of time to talk about that as well. So rather, I'm just going to go and speak through here and show us how the utilisation of the network's changed really over the last couple of years. First of all, as Kerry sort of hinted at in the intro today, there was a bit of a spatial difference throughout Perth if we looked at the total vehicle kilometres travelled, effectively that being a product of the distance travelled by vehicles and the number of vehicles that we have there. We're looking at Perth divided here, I think, by SA3 from memory. So we have about 10 regions, 10 or 15 regions here throughout Perth. The ones in green have seen, comparing June 2021 to June 2019, a decrease over that time. So less vehicles kilometres travelled in 2021 compared to 2019, moving from a yellow, which is about neutral to 10%, up to that dark red that we see in some of those outer areas, with huge increases in vehicle kilometres travelled rather over that time period. As was also stated by Kerry at the start, there has been a fair bit of population growth over pandemic as people have migrated from the east back to Perth. So from ABS measurements and estimates, we've seen about a 2.7% increase in population between June 2019 to June 2021. So we can expect a bit of an increase there in VKT from that population increase nonetheless. Other than that, we can see that around Armidale there and in the inner southeast, sort of your, Belmont, Kewdale south, a little bit east from South Perth there, but Victoria Park sort of area, a decrease. But towards the north there, we do see there is a big increase in vehicle kilometres travelled. I would say that's likely explained by the Northlink works, Tonkin Highway extension of about 20 odd kilometres from the original terminus near Ree Highway up to Ellenbrook. That's provided a means of access there for residents in that area, as well as we can see as sort of that area where Tonkin continues on towards the east there has also increased, as has the area around Coburn as well. Otherwise, most areas throughout Perth have seen some sort of increase over this time, a bit of a lesser increase, but most areas still have seen a fair bit of increase in vehicle kilometres travelled over the time frame. If we look a bit closer and zoom in here, what we have here is we're looking at a graph of what we like to call our CBD cordon traffic, and that's examining primarily the entry points and exit points from the Perth CBD on arterial roads and measuring the daily traffic there. We're taking an average of 2019 to give us our 100% point. And we can see in yellow marked on this graph when we had the various lockdowns throughout Perth. The first lockdown here in early 2020 probably should be considered with a bit of a grain of salt. The terms, I guess, for lack of a better word there, of that lockdown were not particularly strict, certainly compared to what we had in the latter lockdowns and in terms of what we saw over east. But nonetheless, as the first sort of lockdown we can see there was a big decrease, sharp decrease there in terms of traffic compared to 2019, where we can see there is certainly a seasonal pattern to it there, with decreases around Christmas, Easter, and smaller decreases around the school holidays as well. After that first lockdown, we steadily climbed back above the long-term average, well, 2019 average there, until we had our Christmas decrease as well. And then the second lockdown, we dropped to about 70%, so about a 30% decrease there in traffic. But again, much quicker than the first time round. Traffic rebounded quite quickly back to that sort of between 110 and 120% level, before, again, very sharp and quick drops in vehicle traffic before they recovered very quickly thereafter each of those lockdowns as well. From there on, interestingly, certainly over 2022, where things really started to hit us here in Perth, by then we haven't seen too much in terms of decrease, whether that's fatigue or something else, it's hard to say. But certainly the 2022 patterns seem to be doing quite much better than expected. Suburban regions, so looking at counters on major arterials, highways, freeways throughout Perth, so show a relatively similar pattern. Certainly the northern areas do not seem to be recovering as well as the southern areas. This is even taking out Mitchell Freeway, where there's the smart freeway works on at the moment. But what we are seeing is certainly in some areas a recovery at times above the long-term average, or certainly close to it. In terms of public transport, we're just looking here at the monthly aggregate boardings in terms of bus, train, and the overall system in relative terms here, 2019 versus onwards there. And we can actually see in the background as well our COVID cases rapidly increasing. Certainly, we can see there was a big decrease there, down to about 20% of the long-term, well, 2019 average there during the first lockdown, but quite a relatively rapid and well patronised recovery there to about 70 to 80% over 2020, early 2021. Again, a little bit of a drop during that second lockdown, but even back towards the 90% mark there in after the second lockdown in 2021. Certainly, after that, we can see in later 2021, early 2022, getting back towards around that 80-85% mark. Bit of a drop there around Christmas as expected. And from the initial data we had in 2022, things were looking quite good, especially in terms of bus patronage. The last thing we looked at was census data. So comparing the working from home rates in Greater Perth from the Journey to Work data in 2016 and 2021, we can see there is quite a big jump there, rather, from about 4%, 3.9% in 2016, all the way up to 8.6% in 2021. So there was quite a big increase between 2016 and 2021, but at the end of the day, we would really need to put that in perspective. If we consider 100% of people and where they work, we are still talking not even 10% at the end of the day. Looking at Victoria and New South Wales, they do have quite a higher amount of people working from home there as well. The census date in 2021 was Tuesday the 10th of August. At the time, both Victoria and New South Wales were in lockdown, which is probably explaining some of that high percentages there. That being said, even in 2016, they did have a slightly higher rate than us as well. So, oh, sorry, my time has very loudly gone off. So we can see that certainly there are differences in working from home patterns here between Perth and the eastern states as well. So there is certainly a Perth context here to what we are doing, but certainly those lack of lockdowns may, well, we can see here there's quite a bit of difference between the east and the west. I'll pass you over to Brett. Oh, actually, sorry, I think we've got one more slide, and I'll pass you over to Brett. Simply looking as well in terms of who in the census is working from home. We have that huge increase in Perth, about doubling, far more than doubling in Sydney and Melbourne. Brisbane went up to about 15%, so it's a big jump there as well. The highest working from home rates were in professionals in non-frontline occupations, which is understandable. There's more ability there to do work at a location that suits you. we've seen the differences there in public transport patronage as well. But the last thing we'll show here is just a graph of the working from home rate in terms of income bands, and we can sort of see quite a pattern here that as the reported weekly income increases, so does the working from home rate, which seems to support some of the earlier findings we've seen from some of the other presenters. And we can see there quite a low rate in the lower income bands. We also had white collar jobs on the left, so where these professional jobs are located, versus on the right there where the people who work in those jobs live, and we can see that there's quite a high concentration in the inner suburbs, especially the western suburbs, whereas in the actual location of where people are living is a bit more distributed throughout Perth. The more green the region, the higher the volume of jobs or proportion, number of residents or proportion of jobs. So we can see that there is some travel patterns there that might have been disrupted. I'll now hand you over to Brett, who will talk through the scenario portion of the work that we've undertaken. Brett.
All right, I assume you can hear me. Okay, and can you see my screen?
All good.
Like it. Oh, you can.
You've got PowerPoint open rather than
see
the
it.
presenter view, though.
I'm only seeing.
That's good.
Yeah, that's fine for you guys. Okay. All right. Thanks, Tristan. Just before I kick off, Tristan's slides. We did use white and blue collars before I go. The scenarios that I'm about to talk about, or talk to, use the data from Doina's and Caroline's employee surveys. And whilst we had to work with white and blue collar trips with STEM, or the Strategic Modelling Group, we actually developed the proportions of the spatial variation based on, I think, 11 or so job codes. I just wanted to mention that because that's a question that does come up a lot. Why are you only using white and blue collar? No, we're not. We looked at the spatial, the spatial variation based on a richer degree of job codes, employment codes, and then to enact these scenarios, we did have to aggregate. So the purpose of my presentation is to talk about the economic impacts of the increased level of work from home. As Tristan pointed out, work from home is not an entirely new phenomenon. Whilst it's grown over during the pandemic, there was some degree of working from home before the pandemic. So we looked at the economic benefits of the increased level of working from home. So the scenarios were generally, or the purpose of scenarios to help policymakers see the impact on traffic, as well as to evaluate those, or to provide that is based on the usual sort of transport benefits that might go into an infrastructure program appraisal or a travel demand management appraisal. We looked at a series of scenarios, as Kerry pointed out earlier. There was 8 scenarios in total. Here's the main 6 that we used, and then we had two additional ones where we looked at replacement and rebound trips. The survey indicated that the increase of working from home had basically doubled, gone from 5 to 10. I can't remember. Yeah, 5 to 10% would be the way of saying it. And that's in line with the census data. So the work from home rate that seemed to increase over pandemic period was about double the incidence pre-pandemic. From there, we looked at scenarios that might well be occurring on our traffic network, which means that work from home wasn't quite as great, or that we also extended the scenario to see, well, if work from home actually was much larger than observed, what might look like. The other phenomenon that Tristan pointed out at that time, and it seems to be still the case, that the pre-pandemic levels of public transport ridership hadn't been recovered, and the evidence from the smart card rider data and the Public Transport Authority reported data was that Perth's public transport network or ridership was recovering to about 75 to 80% of its 80%, sorry, of pre-pandemic. So we've also looked at this 15% shift from from public transport to private, assuming that these lower levels of public transport have ended up perhaps driving cars. So what does it mean in terms of the decreased level of trips? So I want to look at, say, the ones in orange, as they seem to be for the doubling in working from home incidents. The percentage decrease in traffic, as a scenario looked at when we ran it through STEM, was about 2.5–3% for the 10% model. But if we factored in that there was a shift from public transport to private vehicles, that was a little bit lower. And over here, we look at levels of replacement. Here we replaced all trips taken away from working from home and put them on the network, as well as the 15% mode shift from public transport. And here we looked at if there was the observed increase in traffic, as Tristan showed before, what it might look like. And here we're just talking about the decrease in private vehicle trips. However, because the commuting trips that were observed were much longer and during peak hours, just because there was an increase in trips over those periods, particularly those scenarios on the right, doesn't necessarily mean that translated into negative network effects. So this is the percentage of travel time saving. These are trips that, 10% working from home levels, 20% working from home levels on the left, and over here on the right, the 10% working from home levels, including the public transport. The 7 is the one with the replacement. Okay, and 8 is the one we're thinking about, including the rebound trips. As you can see, that there are, somewhere between 1 and 5% travel time savings. This is an extended scenario. This is not what we're observing on the network. It's just to have a look at what would that mean if working from home to increase. So overall, there has been a savings in travel time, or the scenarios indicated a savings in travel time, no matter which scenario we looked at. One thing that we noticed that the shift away from public transport reduced those travel time savings. But even with replacement and rebounds, because the trips that were being substituted were much shorter in length, there was still some time savings. I'm not going to talk through this slide too much, other than we had to rethink the module that's in STEM and how it works, because if you like, working from home is a relaxation of institutional expectations. So we have what we might call in the economics world constrained demand. So people may wish to work from home more often, but they aren't able to because their institution demands that they don't. So what we needed to do is relook at the way of calculating the benefits by considering this way of thinking that people are constrained by having to go to work. Now it's relaxed, and what those benefits might mean. And then we looked at how that might work for both the people that remain on the network, so the travel time savings that we saw. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but as Kerry pointed out, this is a much larger component, and those people that are able to save 20 minutes or half an hour by not or an hour a day by not traveling to work clearly have much more benefits in terms of travel time savings. So we're going to focus on the remaining network, which I think is more important policy or discussion. So these are the benefits to those that remain on the network. As you can see, it's quite in total, it's quite high for the 20% modules. This is the one that we've been working with as what we think is going on. This is an increase or doubling in working from home rates, so an increase to 10% working from home rates. You can see that negative externalities such as emissions, pollutions makes up a large proportion of it. Private benefits such as private travel time savings and vehicle operating costs also account for 30% of those savings, and it's also now extended to commercial vehicles as well. This is by removing trips. If we also had replacement or rebound, same scenarios, clearly they're a little less, but the proportions relatively the same. A little less here because we're adding trips back to the net. In scale, I suppose one thing that I think of mentioning before, but you can see down here that the private values, because we're putting more vehicles on the road, are negative for those, they're driving around more, but we still have externality savings because those trips are shorter. There's less times.
2 minutes, Brett.
Thanks, Sharon. This is the slide that I believe Kerry showed you before, and that allows you to see some of those values. Notice that for all scenarios, the overall benefits for these for the people that are remaining on the network. We've also got the benefits for those people who are now currently working from home, which are larger. You can see here, even in those sort of what we're trying to, where we think things are, what we're observing is around this area here. There's still substantial benefits of in excess of $100 million per year. This would be using the same function as you would evaluate a new railway, or a new bus service, or a travel demand management type policy, using the same benefits that you might get from ATAP. So finally, just to repeat that there are considerable benefits for those people that do choose to work from home in terms of the vehicle operating costs and their own private time, travel time savings. However, what we're showing here is those by removing a trip from the network, it also benefits others remaining on the network. Even at a sort of a low level, so not quite a doubling, but a half increase due to the pandemic, there's still benefits. But once you start moving, taking public transport or reducing the public transport share of the function, then those benefits are negated and be actually fully negated. And slides have changed this month. So what have we seen is so transport policy has had a long-standing motivation to look at reducing the number of trips during peak hours, and some of these have been the policies that they've looked at, and work from home is clearly an effective policy that mirrors or adds to those travel demand management policies. So on behalf of Tristan and I, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brett. Now we'll look at some productivity impacts from Kirsten.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we're just not seeing the slide view. There you go.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about productivity impacts, which I worked on with Brett, who you just heard from before. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of our approach to assessing productivity changes before going on to just giving a brief overview of the data. You've seen lots of it already. And the commuting and time savings, then looking at the reallocation of time spent commuting and productivity gains, and then some concluding comments. So first of all, our approach to assessing productivity, because really productivity can be seen in a couple of ways, but the way that productivity is normally assessed is through work productivity or the productivity of a company or a nation. And that is the number of the output per cost of the employee or hours of the employee. But there is a sort of a broader way of looking at productivity, and that is on the behalf of the employee, which is looking at not only output per hours, but also the capacity to do other things. And when you're looking at working from home, it really means that there's much less distinction between home and work life. An employee doesn't just go straight to work, and when they leave their home, that's sort of end. They're actually a lot of the work and home blends into one. And so it's really about the productivity increases may be due to this reallocation then of commuting time to work. So if we assume that the work time remains the same, but there is a commuting to work time that is reallocated into other areas. And that's what we were sort of looking at in what we were doing. And not only do we have this sort of direct reallocation, which may be from that commuting time into work or into other activities, but there's also greater satisfaction during work hours where you've got improved worker well-being, which then also increases your productivity. So these are sort of indirect productivity effects. So we sort of adopted this alternative approach to examining this and understanding these broader socioeconomic aspects. Okay, so looking at the data, we took our data from the third wave. You've seen that there were several waves of data. We focused in on the third wave, and there were specific questions that we put in terms of trying to understand how commuting time might be reallocated. And this was just a general profile of the respondents, and you can see here the majority of them were female, most were full-time workers, and then of course the overwhelming majority were female full-time and part-time workers. And there was 577 respondents that we were looking at. So most of the people that responded, there's 577 people. Most of them worked between 30 and 50 hours, and they commuted between 4.7 to around 5 hours per week. And that was, and those sort of hours didn't really decrease if they were working over a 60-hour week. And those that were sort of more part-time workers, so your workers that were going less than 20 hours or 20 to 30 hours, they were significantly less in terms of commuting. So they actually commuted less during the week because they were going less, but also probably not quite as far. And then you had the hours saved by not commuting. So when there wasn't commuting, there was most saved less than, you can see most of them are saving less than an hour or 1 to 2 hours. And that was around about, into the 2 to 3 hours a week that was saved. But the longer the commute time, the more savings, which is, that's not unexpected. And that's where you get this reallocation of how time was spent. So the more savings, the more reallocation that we saw. So in terms of how time was actually reallocated, this was overall over those 577 people. We see the majority of people actually reallocated the commuting time into, so 41%, into their working in their primary or current job, with 2% into a new or secondary job. So that's where the majority of time, which was spent otherwise commuting, was put into. There was about 32% put it into some sort of leisure. So you've got the outdoor exercise or the recreation indoor, and about 26% put it into either household work or childcare. So and so it's really interesting then to look at how this is allocated between work and non-work times. And there's and you can see the graph below, the proportion of time saved through fewer commutes, and then the time allocated to activities other than work. And the more time that's saved, particularly when we get to day 2 or day 4, when you've got time savings there, actually there's quite a lot of time that's given back to work, or increasingly is done in activities other than work. So these it really represents sort of how workers are extracting greater health and well-being as well from the change in lifestyle. So if we look then at, we broke down by attributes. So we can see this overview, the first, I don't know whether you see my my cursor there, but you can see this overview. I've just showed you that 41% that went into the work, but we can also break this down by gender and occupation, industry, so by different attributes, and try and understand, well, how does commuting actually impact different types of workers? So by gender, what is really interesting when you look across these is there is a stereotype that is associated with. So males tended to give more to their primary source of work, females slightly less, the percentage, but females were much more in home duties and childcare. And you know, and it really goes to these stereotypes in how people work, or the expectations that are expected on them in home as well. Occupation, we found workers in more flexible occupations, so those occupations that were able to go online very easily, rather than these frontline occupations that needed to be sort of you know, that there was no choice, but they needed to come to work, or to face up to work. The more flexible the occupation, so they could stay home, then there was actually more allocation to their primary occupation, which again is not surprising. Whereas if frontline workers, if they're having to stay at home, then obviously there's less hours at work. By industry, we see that in terms of the primary job, there's sort of a greater overall sort of in terms of your frontline and your mixed hybrid, where there's more given to those sorts of industries. So your healthcare, and that was also in terms of WA, was your resource sector. So, and this would very much reflect what was happening during those COVID areas, where those particular industries continued to go through the pandemic, and there was a demand on them. In terms of commuting distance and employment type, we see that the more distance travelled by a person, so the further away they are from their work, and those people that were full-time employees, there was actually more given to primary jobs. So people were actually not, they may commute far, but actually the further their commute, they actually gave more back to primary jobs. So it actually was better for those, if you're looking at workers who are coming from far away. And in terms of age group, it really reflected sort of the life cycle. So you can look at the different age groups, and you know, those people that are very much in the age of having kids and that sort of thing, of course, they have more in childcare, in house duties, and then you see some of the other age groups, they're reallocating it according to whether they're more interested in career or whether they're sort of going out and more, they're more on that leisure end of the spectrum.
2 minutes, Kirsten.
Okay, so productivity gains over time. We see that there's a reallocation. So there's an applied productivity. So if we're looking at the same output over a shorter period, which is what we would assume that people are not going to, they're going to work, but they're actually, there's greater productivity. But they're doing more sort of for a less time, then we had a productivity gain. So in terms of income, that productivity gain, the higher the income, the more productivity gain we were seeing. So people are more reallocating towards, there's an increase in output, the greater the household income was. And that same sort of, when we're looking at sort of, if we estimate the amount of output that is done if we were at the workplace, so in a normal sort of situation, then irrespective of income, there is a reallocation between 52 and 60 minutes of work per week, except for that really high, significantly above income level where there's a much more that is reallocated towards work per week. It's 89 minutes. And we can see this for in terms of the economic output, the average economic output that's there, and we can sort of like the average is about 50, whereas and then going into the maximum time reallocated to work as well, we see most of it doesn't change except when you go to significantly above. There's people are giving significantly less maximum. The maximum time was significantly less. So just a few concluding comments. The productivity gains when you're looking at working from home are complex. I don't think you can just look at it from in terms of output at work. It's from a range of things, and that's what impacts well-being and overall worker productivity. So we were really looking at the reallocation of commuting time to other activities, as well as trying to understand what actual work productivity was also gained. And it really, when we're looking at this redistribution, it depended upon the socioeconomic characteristics, and the productivity gains were found in both the increase in work direct as well as your domestic and leisure activities, which would have had an indirect impact on productivity. When productivity is measured by converting the unproductive commuting time into domestic or leisure, there's an implied productivity gain of 1.844% for the entire population sample that we had, and 5.4% for only those respondents that recorded a greater working from home. So we see that there's actually significant productivity gains that were found in our samples. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Then we're back to Kerry to wrap up in terms of policy implications.
Microphone would help, and so the camera, and now the slideshow.
And please just add, while we're waiting for Kerry, just add some of your questions to chat. We've got 5 questions there if you've got any more, so that we can just quickly deal with them after Kerry's wrap up.
Okay, can you now see Perth findings in the wider context? No.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Good. I'm then thinking everyone's turned their mic off. Okay, well, this is trying to say, is Perth any different? Certainly, you'll recall at the beginning that Claire pointed out that this was one of 4 projects being funded through the iMove Centre, and quite a lot of it was coming from David Hensch's work and Vijay's over in New South Wales. So we've got a lot of knowledge for Greater Sydney, for Brisbane, and also for South Australia. And we kept saying, well, is Perth any different? So I was asked to go through the published literature and find out, well, is Perth different? And I'm afraid what I'm beginning with is a health warning. The problem with publications is that they take quite some time to go through, certainly academic publications, to get out and into publication. So most of the material we were able to see refers to that first pandemic year of 2020. So as yet, we've not got good academic insight or policy responses that have been inspired by the journey out of the pandemic. And then another health warning that, of course, findings from one location or region aren't necessarily immediately comparable to Greater Perth, partly because we drew on literature not just from Australia, but across the globe. And as you'll all be well aware, the pandemic experiences were quite different. The policy response to the pandemic varied. Some places were subject to a succession of long and very strict lockdowns. Melbourne, good case in point, with even limits to how far they could travel. While others had a much more liberal regime of pandemic management based chiefly on recommendations or some sort of idea of applying a moral compass. And then locations also differ globally in terms of their urban structure, their diversity of transport options, and the extent to which these were curtailed or otherwise restricted during the pandemic. So some places people were actively discouraged from using public transport. So with all those sort of health warnings in mind, I think if we take the big helicopter view, that despite that, I think these sort of bigger changes that you see elsewhere in the world are also mirrored in Greater Perth. That is, that there has been a significant acceleration in work from home practice. Greater Perth is missing there. It's certainly consistent with other Australian and American studies, and that it's this hybrid work from home pattern that's the most popular. It's also the experience in Europe. Of note is the preference by employees to continue to work from home. It appears that the office-based occupation and industries are more likely to be able to work from home, although others are reporting that in any occupation there are tasks that can be undertaken at home rather than on site, and that work from home has mainly been a positive experience for many employees in the US and Europe, as in Greater Perth. That's not to say that we should ignore the negative experiences, of course, but the benefits of not commuting to the workplace every day are shared by others and reported in other studies. It's hard to translate reductions in travel distance and number of trips because of this problem with variation in urban structures, the geographic size of cities, the transport system, and so on. But one thing that seems to be holding constant is the reduction in public transport patronage has been mirrored elsewhere, either to a lesser or greater extent. So there are different experiences as we come out of the pandemic. If I move then on to the policy initiatives that we were asked to identify, so they basically drawn from the whole team. So having completed their various research strand, they were asked to say, well, what are the key highlights? What are the sorts of initiatives that need attention in terms of future policy making if work from home is to be supported in order to achieve travel demand management? What we've done is organise these initiatives by the different sectors. So there are initiatives within the domain of transport, within urban planning, infrastructure, environment, and society. So I think the most important thing I want to draw attention to here is that if any one sector wants to pursue these policy initiatives, it would be a mistake not to consider them as part of an integrated package, because that's where things get unpicked. If we're trying to improve the situation for work from home, we need to think about it in an integrated way. We were asked by Claire to identify the initiatives that the transport portfolio should start addressing, and that's why I'm really flagging this integrated package, because this is what happens. One portfolio says, what should we do? And clearly the transport portfolio have been a key player in this research, but if they go alone and don't address the initiatives that we've grouped under society, then the positive things that might be achieved by promoting work from home will come undone. So, but Claire asked us to say, well, what should the transport portfolio start working on? I've highlighted those in green here. They're more specifically detailed in the overview report. So the sorts of initiatives we were thinking about is, should there be a carbon reduction plan applied to businesses? Should there be an attempt to think about how employees commute to work and whether they can be encouraged to either commute a couple of days less per week, and certainly to commute by public transport if the distance so requires, or active modes, to address or continue to address parking strategies in order to discourage car travel, to encourage individuals who work from home to use more environmentally friendly means of transport when they're accessing services in their local area. Critical, I think, is to consider policy in terms of how we balance commuting patterns. So I think it was Doina that said we're seeing a pattern where Monday and Fridays are the most favoured day. Certainly that came out in the interviews with businesses, although others had an insistence perhaps that staff came in on a Thursday for a general gathering. But it's the balance of these patterns, working from home patterns across the working week, which is more likely to protect the public transport network and to achieve the benefits on the road network. So looking at back into the suburbs now to think, well, if more people are at home, how do we address amenity and safety? Deferring major infrastructure funding for roads which encourage private vehicle travel, thinking about active travel strategies, continuing the travel demand management policies for children's independent travel to school, thinking about how to incentivise peak spreading, so picking up this again in relation to balancing commuting patterns. And then 3 more items, one around converting road and car parking space for pedestrian uses in busy centres. So again, picking up on this issue about amenity and safety, particularly in local suburban areas. Thinking about how the public transport network and services can better serve non-CBD travel. And thinking about a congestion charge for private vehicle journeys. So starting to think about areas that have very rich public transport accessibility and opportunity within the inner suburbs and the Perth CBD, a way of incentivising public transport use for journeys from the outer suburbs into the CBD. Then on the environment sector, 2 items. The first relating back to the idea of a carbon reduction plan and Australia's goal to have net zero emissions by 2050, which the team think is paramount to encouraging a reduction in single occupant car trips.
2 minutes, Kerry.
Yeah, okay. Urban planning then, we're picking up on the thoughts around shared work, co-worker spaces that can encourage more flexible working from home. And certainly employers have expressed an interest in setting up, if you like, satellite places or utilising co-worker spaces so that people have access to some of the facilities they don't necessarily have at home. Well, I'm trying to pick up things. So in new housing areas that developers provide local services closer to residents, but an attention to regulatory reform around home-based businesses to support that. Certainly in terms of infrastructure, one of the negative experiences of working from home that businesses raised was the poor digital infrastructure in terms of reliability and access. So certainly upgrades to that infrastructure, to thinking about the workability environment of the home, better data and monitoring on working from home. We've highlighted all sorts of issues with how we classify workers in terms of occupation or industry type, for example, how we monitor it more broadly. In terms of society, encourage work from home to enhance participation in employment, various ideas around tax relief. But I think importantly is picking up on some of the material that Caroline was presenting around training to support managers who manage those who work from home, to prevent senior managers from closely monitoring individuals, to think about how to incentivize work from home, such as contributing towards employees' overhead costs. Given, I mean, that certainly links with issues about some businesses actually contracting in floor space and saving money there. Work from home, maintaining as something that is voluntary, not making it mandatory, and the organisation being ready for that. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Kerry. If we go through the questions now in the last 10 minutes, there was some interest in the observed trends that public transport here has recovered quite well as opposed to New South Wales. There was also a question as did we come up with any ideas around why bus had recovered better than train. We threw around quite a lot of ideas. We don't have any evidence for any of those. So maybe I'll flick that one. Just Tristan, just reiterate, it may have been covered in Tristan's presentation in terms of the public transport recovery. Did you just want to say 2 sentences about that, Tristan?
I was actually just going to say there's been a bit of discussion about those questions in the chat themselves, and there's a suggestion there that a lot of the works for MetroNet could have an effect, and there's been a lot of initiatives on the public transport network of late, which makes, I guess, 2019 very different to post 2019, not just COVID, but the effect of new services and changes in fare caps and things like that as well.
So we didn't particularly look at those factors. The other factor that was raised from Andrew Cox was, we just used the 2021 strategic transports model baseline figures and ran the scenarios off that. The question was, there's been discussion around whether unemployment rates have been incredibly low in Perth and whether that would have had an impact on our results. We did pick up that population increased and that caused increases in vehicle kilometres travelled. I suppose it's a similar question to that, Tristan and Brett. Did we look at any increases in unemployment, or that wouldn't have influenced our scenarios because we ran it off a 2021 base?
Okay. Yeah, I think that the latter point is correct. Is we couldn't measure everything, and the fact is that we weren't forecasting. So the 2021 forecast, what we call our baseline from STEM, our counterfactual evidence, and then we looked at how the scenarios compared to that evidence. Now, what actually was going on in the network, as Tristan has shown in a few slides, and the discussion on the chat room here, many moving parts, so very difficult to measure what actually occurs. And we have a transport survey that might help us with that.
Then there was a question which perhaps Caroline can shed some light on, although it was also nothing that we looked at specifically, just the perception that perhaps working from home opened up a more diverse range of job opportunities for respondents.
Yeah, we didn't look at that directly, but I agree. Working from home, obviously people who are disabled or social, I suppose, don't like social situations, things like that, they obviously have more opportunities to join in the workforce from home. I don't have any evidence on it. I do know from literature that people can also be disadvantaged by working from home. So you tend to have people, for instance, who have like young children and things at home, and they can be overlooked if they're not in the workplace for things like opportunities to progress and career progressions. I think there are double-edged swords. So I don't think working from home is a panacea for everyone. I think it needs to be, look at it for the individual, and many factors can play into it. For some people, it could be great. It can mean that they can join the workforce. For other people, it might have negative effects. So I think we need to, it's just quite complex, but it's not something that we actually looked at in our data.
And then the last question was for Doina, around the interest in the increase in number of shopping trips and parcel deliveries. Again, a contrast with New South Wales, where they actually haven't looked at increases in commercial vehicles as part of their scenario building or their assumptions. Doina, we just confirm the shopping trip and parcel delivery increases that we saw.
They increased substantially compared to 2019 or the 2020 for January, February. The extent to which other shopping trips or rebound travel occurred in relation to working from home needs to be established using the past data. So our survey was only including use of time over day and not a trip diary with all the activities. The focus was on commuting. I would like to add one comment to those unemployment opportunities or working from home that can improve opportunities for employment. It is important to remember that our sample worked a minimum of 10 hours in the previous week, and we didn't have any person who was unemployed between wave 1 and wave 3. There were cases when people had unemployment in 2020 as a result of closing businesses. But the changes between waves in the 3 locations, hybrid, working from home and working from the workplace, suggest very little transition.
Thanks, Doina. Kirsten, did you want to add something on the job opportunities question? I just thought sorry, I saw you putting up your hand.
No, I didn't. Sorry. Can you just remind me, give me a
No, don't worry about it. All the question was about was whether working from home has opened up a more diverse range of job opportunities for respondents.
Definitely, particularly for females. I think you'll find that, or people that may be traditionally have less opportunities to go into the workplace. So, and that's probably, even when we're looking at the productivity data, you can sort of see that females are really whilst there's sort of increases to the putting it back into work, there's a lot being put into the house as well. So I would say that particularly for females, that it's allowing a lot more to have full-time work or to do more work and to do more diverse work, so to work further from home, which probably was not open before.
Thanks, Kirsten. I think we've got 4 minutes left, so I would like to thank you all for your participation. We will have the overview report available on the Patrick website, but the report is still being reviewed by our iMove partners currently. It's although the overview report is quite fairly short, it has a very long supporting document with all the analytics in it, which I'm sure is taking them quite a while to go through. So thank you very much, everybody. Claire, did you want to say a final word?
I think probably I'd just like to thank you all for your really hard work on this project over an 18-month period. Obviously, it's quite a complex piece of work, and you know, we can sort of see that there's a lot of moving parts here that are really difficult to explain. I think too, you know, we probably in some ways benefited in terms of our experience of the pandemic and the timing of when we conducted our research, in that we were sort of in the field when the cases started to peak, whereas had we have gone a bit earlier like some of the others, we might have missed exposure to that. So, you know, I'm really glad that we've had that experience. But look, thank you everyone for your presentation today. You know, I'm hoping that a lot of people have got a lot of benefit out of this, and you know, we're looking forward to having it available for other people on the iMove website and so forth, and look forward to receiving the slides. Sharon, if we could get the chat as well, that might help some of us in terms of further responding to questions, that'd be great. But yeah, look, really pleased that we've managed to draw this work together, and you know, I think it's been a great collaborative effort, so thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire, and thanks to Charisse for handling things in the background, and she will have the recording available. We'll try and take out some of the big breaks when we were sharing, and we will also have the chat available. So thanks very much, everybody.